Mark Thompson drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, watching the gas pump numbers climb. The Sunday evening traffic stretched along the highway behind the rural gas station, everyone rushing back to the city after a weekend escape. He and Ellie had spent 3 days in a cabin by the lake, a getaway that was supposed to help them reconnect after months of tiptoeing around each other following the miscarriage. "I'm grabbing some snacks," Ellie called through the open window, her voice carrying that forced cheerfulness she'd adopted lately. "Want anything?" "Coffee would be great," Mark replied, mustering a smile. "The biggest they have." He watched his wife walk into the convenience store, her shoulders slightly hunched. 4 months had passed since they lost what would have been their first child, and the invisible wall between them only seemed to grow taller. The weekend had been pleasant enough on the surface, hiking, reading, making dinner together. But the silence between activities had been deafening. The gas pump clicked, pulling Mark from his thoughts. As he replaced the nozzle, a movement near the edge of the parking lot caught his eye. Something large and gray-brown slinking between cars. Probably just someone's dog, he thought, closing the gas cap and climbing back into the driver's seat. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through emails that had accumulated over the weekend. A strange scratching sound drew his attention to the rear of the car. Mark looked up into the rearview mirror but couldn't see anything. The sound came again, more insistent. Sighing, he opened his door and stepped out. That's when he saw it. A German shepherd, so thin its ribs protruded like barrel staves beneath its dull, matted fur. The dog was cautiously approaching their car, head low, ears flat against its skull. Its movements were stiff, almost painful to watch. "Hey, buddy," Mark said softly, keeping his distance. "You lost?" The dog froze, yellow-brown eyes fixing on Mark with an intensity that made him step back. There was something desperate in that gaze, something that transcended the normal wariness of a stray. The German shepherd trembled visibly, its tail tucked tightly against its emaciated body. Mark glanced toward the convenience store. Ellie was still inside, probably stuck in the weekend checkout line. He looked back at the dog, unsure what to do. He'd never had pets growing up. His mother was allergic, and Ellie's apartment building had a strict no-pets policy that they'd maintained when he moved in after the wedding 2 years ago. "Sorry, buddy," he said finally, turning back toward the driver's seat. "I can't help you." But as he opened his door, the rear door of their SUV, left ajar when Ellie had grabbed her purse, caught the dog's attention. Before Mark could react, the German shepherd made a decision. With what seemed like its last reserves of energy, the dog lunged forward and leaped into their back seat. "Hey!" Mark shouted, more from surprise than anger. "No, no, no! You can't be in there!" The dog didn't growl or bark. Instead, it tucked itself into the footwell behind the passenger seat, making itself as small as possible, trembling violently. When Mark reached toward the door handle to open it wider, the dog pressed itself further into the space, eyes never leaving Mark's face. Mark stood frozen, hand on the door, utterly at a loss. The dog wasn't aggressive. If anything, it seemed terrified. But there was something else in its expression, an almost human desperation that made Mark hesitate to force it out. "What's going on?" Mark turned to see Ellie approaching, coffee in one hand, a small bag of snacks in the other. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock as she peered past him into the back seat. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is that a dog?" "It just jumped in," Mark explained, gesturing helplessly. "I was about to get it out." Ellie set her purchases on the hood of the car and leaned in for a closer look. The German shepherd's eyes darted to her, then back to Mark, its breathing rapid and shallow. "Mark, he's starving," Ellie whispered, her voice catching. "Look at his ribs, and his neck. There are wounds all around it, like from a collar that was too tight." Mark leaned in beside her and saw what she meant. Beneath the matted fur around the dog's neck, raw, infected-looking flesh was visible. The dog's flanks were sunken, its hip bones protruding sharply. Now that he looked more closely, he could see old scars across its muzzle and one ear that was slightly torn. "He needs help," Ellie said, a new firmness in her voice that Mark hadn't heard in months. Ellie, we can't take in a stray dog. The apartment. I'm not saying we keep him, she interrupted, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. But we can't just leave him here like this. He's sick, Mark. He's dying. The German shepherd watched their exchange with uncanny awareness, its eyes moving between them as if following the conversation. When Ellie spoke the word dying, it made a small, whimpering sound, the first noise they'd heard from it. Mark ran a hand through his hair, weighing options. They could call animal control, but in this rural area on a Sunday evening, who knew how long it would take for someone to respond? They could try to find the dog's owner, but the condition of the animal suggested either severe neglect or a long time on its own. There's an emergency vet clinic about 20 minutes from here just off the highway, Ellie said, already pulling out her phone to look up the address. We can at least get him checked for a microchip, make sure he gets some food and water. Mark looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. The dullness that had clouded her eyes since the miscarriage had been replaced by something bright and focused. She was present in a way she hadn't been in months. The dog whimpered again, a sound so pitiful it seemed to bypass all rational thought and strike directly at something primal in Mark's chest. "Fine," he said finally, "but we're just taking him to the vet, that's all. Someone must be missing him." Ellie's face brightened momentarily before she controlled her expression. "Of course. We'll just make sure he's okay." As they settled into the front seats, Ellie turned to look at their unexpected passenger. The German shepherd had made no attempt to climb onto the seat proper, remaining huddled in the footwell, as if afraid that taking up too much space might cause them to reconsider. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're going to help you." Mark watched in the rearview mirror as the dog's ears twitched at the sound of Ellie's voice. Something about the animal's desperate trust, jumping into a stranger's car, refusing to leave despite its obvious fear, struck him as both heartbreaking and remarkable. As he pulled out of the gas station, Ellie opened the bag of beef jerky she'd bought and carefully handed a small piece back to the dog. The German shepherd sniffed it cautiously before taking it with surprising gentleness from her fingers. The food disappeared in seconds. "He's starving," Ellie whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Mark nodded, keeping his focus on the road while Ellie continued to offer small pieces of jerky to the dog. By the time they'd gone 5 miles, the animal had cautiously shifted position, moving slightly closer to Ellie's extended hand. When the jerky was gone, the dog did something neither of them expected. It rested its head against the center console, as close to Ellie as it could get from its position in the back, and closed its eyes. A complicated emotion tightened Mark's throat. The simple trust of this abused, neglected creature was somehow more affecting than any human interaction he'd had in months. In the passenger seat, Ellie was silently crying, one hand resting near the dog's muzzle. Neither spoke for the remainder of the drive. The weight of the moment, this unexpected detour, this creature that had literally thrown itself into their path, seemed to require silence. The only sound was the dog's labored breathing and the occasional soft word of reassurance from Ellie. When they pulled into the parking lot of the emergency veterinary clinic, the reality of what they were doing finally hit Mark. This wasn't just a good deed, a brief delay in their return to normal life. Whatever happened in the next hour would change something. He could feel it with a certainty that was as inexplicable as it was undeniable. "We're here," Ellie said softly to the dog, whose eyes opened immediately, alert despite its exhaustion. "Let's get you some help." The German shepherd looked from Ellie to Mark, then back again. Slowly, painfully, it lifted itself from the footwell and stood shakily on the back seat. For the first time, they could see its full condition in the harsh parking lot lights. The sight made Ellie gasp and Mark swallow hard. Every rib was visible, every vertebra a knob along its back. Its coat was patchy, missing entirely in some places where old wounds had healed poorly. Yet, standing there, gathering what strength it had left, the dog possessed a dignity that struck them both into momentary silence. Then, as if making its final plea, the German Shepherd took a single step forward and gently placed one paw on the center console between them. Mark and Ellie looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them for the first time in months. Whatever barriers grief had erected, this moment, this desperate animal's trust, had created a hairline crack in the wall. "Come on," Mark said finally, opening his door. "Let's see what the vet says." As Ellie carefully helped the dog out of the back seat, supporting its frail body with gentle hands, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just taken a turn neither of them had anticipated, all because they'd left a car door open at exactly the right moment. The fluorescent lighting of the veterinary clinic cast harsh shadows across the German Shepherd's gaunt face. He sat trembling between Mark and Ellie in the otherwise empty waiting room, his body leaning slightly against Ellie's leg. Though the dog had managed to walk from the car to the building, each step had seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "First-time pet owners?" the receptionist asked, her eyes soft with concern as she glanced at the emaciated animal. "Oh, he's not," Mark began. "We just found him," Ellie interrupted. "He jumped into our car at a gas station about 20 minutes from here." The receptionist nodded, unsurprised. "You'd be amazed how often that happens. Dogs know when they need help, and sometimes they just pick their people." She handed them a clipboard. "Fill this out as best you can, and Dr. Reeves will see you shortly." As Mark stared at the form with its questions about the dog's name, age, and medical history, Ellie gently stroked the German Shepherd's head. The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly in what seemed like relief. "What should we put for his name?" Mark whispered. Ellie considered the dog, noting how, despite his weakened state, his eyes remained alert, tracking every movement in the clinic with intelligence. "Scout," she said finally, "because he scouted us out at the gas station." Mark wrote it down, surprised by how easily he accepted a name for a dog they weren't keeping. "Age unknown, breed German Shepherd, medical history unknown," he continued, moving through the form. A side door opened and a tall woman in scrubs appeared. "Scout," she called, consulting her tablet. Mark and Ellie exchanged a glance, both momentarily startled by the sound of the name they'd just chosen. "That's us, I guess," Mark said, rising to his feet. Ellie stood beside him, and Scout struggled to his feet, still keeping close to her leg. Dr. Reeves led them to an exam room, her expression changing as she got a better look at Scout under the brighter lights. "How long have you had him?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral as she helped the dog onto the exam table. "About 45 minutes, Ellie answered. "He literally jumped into our car at a gas station. We've never seen him before." The tension visibly left the veterinarian's shoulders. "Thank you for bringing him in. Not everyone would have." Her hands moved gently over Scout's body, feeling each protruding rib, examining the raw wounds around his neck, checking his ears and eyes. Scout remained perfectly still, only the occasional tremble revealing his fear. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated," Dr. Reeves said, her fingers gently parting Scout's fur to reveal more scars beneath. "These older wounds suggest he's been mistreated for some time. I'd estimate he's been on his own for at least a few weeks, but the neglect started long before that." She looked up at Mark and Ellie. "Let me check for a microchip." The scanner beeped negatively. "No chip," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "Unfortunately, that's common with neglect cases. People who don't take proper care of their animals rarely bother with identification." She continued her examination, growing increasingly grim as she discovered more evidence of Scout's suffering. A tooth broken near the gum line. Scarring patterns consistent with being struck repeatedly with something narrow, like a stick or rod. Paws with cracked pads suggesting long periods on rough surfaces without adequate rest. Ellie's hand found Mark's, her fingers cold and tight around his. It was the first time she'd reached for him without prompting in months. "Can you help him?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Dr. Reeves nodded, her professional demeanor softening. We can. He's in rough shape, but I don't see any signs of organ failure. With proper nutrition, medication, and care, he could make a full recovery. She paused, looking between them. The question is, what happens after I treat him today? Mark felt the weight of her gaze, understanding the implicit question. They'd brought Scout in as good Samaritans, not as owners. The clinic couldn't just release a stray dog back to the streets. We have a relationship with the county shelter, Dr. Reeves continued when neither answered immediately. But I'll be honest, they're overcrowded, and a dog in Scout's condition will require special care they may not be able to provide. Ellie's grip on Mark's hand tightened painfully. What are you saying? I'm saying that without someone to foster him through his recovery, his options are limited. The shelter will do their best, but... She let the sentence hang unfinished. The three of them stood in silence, the only sound Scout's labored breathing. The dog's eyes moved between them, as if he understood the gravity of the conversation. Could we? Ellie began, then stopped looking at Mark. Is fostering him a possibility? Mark felt himself at a crossroads. Their apartment building's no pets policy was strict, a policy he'd always appreciated as someone with no interest in animals. Their lives were already complicated enough with both of them working long hours and trying to navigate the emotional minefield of their grief. Adding a traumatized, sick dog to the equation seemed like insanity. But there was something in Ellie's face he hadn't seen in months, a spark of purpose, of connection. And seeing Scout's intelligent eyes fixed on them with such naked hope shook something loose in him. How long would the recovery take? He asked, surprising himself. Dr. Reeves seemed to sense the shift in his resolve. The physical recovery will be several months. He needs to gain at least 20 pounds, and those wounds need time to heal properly. But the emotional recovery... She glanced at Scout, who was now leaning against Ellie's hand. That's harder to predict. He's clearly been through severe trauma, but he's already showing remarkable trust in you both. That's a very good sign. Mark took a deep breath, running mental calculations. Their apartment lease was up for renewal in 2 months anyway. Their finances were stable enough to absorb some unexpected vet bills. And if he was completely honest with himself, the thought of turning Scout over to an overcrowded shelter made his stomach twist uncomfortably. We'd need to work something out with our landlord, he said carefully, watching Ellie's face transform with hope. And I don't know the first thing about caring for a dog, especially one with special needs. Dr. Reeves smiled. We can help with that. We offer support for foster families, including training on administering medications and managing recovery. She turned to her computer, typing quickly. Let me put together a treatment plan for today and some information on what fostering would entail. You can think it over while we get him started on fluids and his first round of antibiotics. When she left the room, Ellie turned to Mark, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Are you serious about this? We could really foster him? Mark looked at Scout, who was watching him with those unnerving, intelligent eyes. I think we need to try, he said quietly, at least until he's healthy enough for a permanent home. He wasn't sure if he was making this decision for Scout or for Ellie or for some unnameable need in himself. All he knew was that driving away and leaving this dog behind was no longer an option he could consider. Ellie leaned forward, pressing her forehead against Scout's. Did you hear that? You're coming home with us. The German Shepherd's tail moved, just the slightest twitch but unmistakable. It was the first time they'd seen any movement there, and something about the small gesture of hope in such a broken body caught in Mark's throat. Dr. Reeves returned with a technician, who gently lifted Scout from the exam table. We'll get him started on IV fluids and take some blood for testing, she explained. It should take about an hour. In the meantime, I prepared some information about fostering and a preliminary treatment plan. She handed Mark a folder. Take some time to talk it through. This is a big commitment, and you should both be certain. As the technician carried Scout from the room, The dog looked back at Mark and Ellie with an expression that seemed to hold both fear and hope in equal measure. When the door closed behind them, Ellie turned to Mark, her expression more alive than he'd seen it in months. "Thank you," she whispered, taking his hands in hers. "I know this is crazy, but it feels right somehow." Mark nodded, unable to explain even to himself the certainty he felt. He opened the folder Dr. Reeves had given them, scanning the care instructions, medication schedules, and dietary guidelines. The recovery would be intensive. Special food given in small, frequent meals, multiple medications, regular veterinary checkups, gradual exercise as Scout gained strength. "Our apartment," he said, voicing the most immediate practical concern. "The lease specifically says no pets." Ellie bit her lip, thinking, what if we talk to Mrs. Chen directly, explain the situation? She's always been reasonable, and this is temporary. Mark wasn't so sure about their landlord's flexibility, but he nodded. "We can try, and worst case we find a pet-friendly place when our lease is up in 2 months." They continued discussing logistics, rearranging their work schedules to ensure Scout was never alone too long, budgeting for the unexpected expenses, researching what supplies they'd need.